The one type of vanity is that of the persona, the model, with the conceit, as it were, or bordering on narcissism. Extreme narcissism. I only care about myself. I don't care about anyone else. And that can be described as a kind of vanity. But I think narcissism or conceit is possibly a better word. Whereas the more common kind of vanity, I think, is a kind of obsessive desire for praise or admiration from other people.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose Robinson Erhardt with his eldest geesling, Pins the Podcat, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 120. And this episode is with Simon Blackburn, who is officially retired now. I think has been for a little while, but he was professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, and then Edna J. Koury, distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This is Simon's second appearance on the show. The last one was also really great, too. This was episode 68, and we talked about the work Simon is best known for philosophically, which is his defense of the position of moral quasi-realism in the area of metaethics, which, if you don't know, is the more abstract, hence the term meta, though meta, I think, means after in ancient Greek, the more abstract dimension of ethics, in which questions such as, how do we know ethical truths? Are there moral facts? What are moral properties? Etc. and the like are asked. So if that interests you, you should definitely check out episode 68. But in this episode, Simon and I talk about material from his two latest books, Lust and Mirror Mirror, which are not super recent, but which are all about love and sex. And so we talk about L'Oreal and the "because you're worth it" catchphrase, which is the linchpin of Mirror Mirror. We go through the Tale of Narcissus. We talk about psychology and narcissism, pride, self-esteem, and more. And check out those books. There are links to them in the description. Likes, comments, subscribes are always helpful. There's a Discord. You can find it through robinsonerhardt.com. I have these two other shows where I eat ice cream and other food things live streamed on Twitch and YouTube called Robinson Eats. And I think that's all I'll say today. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Simon. In our last conversation, we spoke at length about metaethics and quasi-realism, but you've also written a number of books and papers, of course, on other subjects. So truth, for instance, and then ethics more broadly construed. But I'm particularly curious about how you see your works on love. So Mirror, Mirror, and then Lust, I guess, which is self-titled, as fitting into your larger philosophical corpus, especially since they aren't so obviously classifiable as standard analytic fodder.
No, they're not. I think I probably explained that to some extent historically. Lust arose because there was a joint enterprise between Oxford University Press, who was my publisher for many years, and the New York Public Library, who wanted to mount a lecture series on the 7 deadly sins. And so they trawled around for people to pick a sin. And I thought lust was far and away the most interesting sin. So I suggested that, and nobody else seemed to pick it up. So I got the gig and enjoyed it enormously. It was probably the most enjoyable book I had to write. So that was that book, and it didn't, as you rightly say, fit what you might call my academic profile. It it was a topic in which I had a normal, healthy interest, I think, but nothing professional. Mirror, Mirror, the history was rather different. That arose out of an effort to understand a feature of my own psychology, which was as I say in the book, I think the visceral hatred and sense of despair that the advertising for L'Oreal, the perfume manufacturer, generated in me. Their famous ad was "Because you're worth it." That was the byline, and I wanted to call the book that, but Princeton got cold feet and said they thought L'Oreal were playing copyright in the phrase and things. So we had to call it Mirror Mirror. It was basically about the sense of self-worth or vanity or narcissism, conceit, all those emotions, which are slightly different, but which seem to sort of cluster around the me generation and the appeal that L'Oreal was mounting. So I was interested in that, and I made jottings over several years. The book came out in 2014, which is a pity because that was before people like Trump and Boris Johnson sort of really tried to wreck democracy, and they were narcissists or somewhere on the spectrum of narcissism. Each of them believed they could do no wrong. Each of them had an insane confidence in their own judgment. In the book, the latest examples I had were people like Tony Blair and Mitt Romney, who weren't quite in the same category of horror.
No, not in the same ballpark.
No. So in a way, that's a shame. But maybe one day I'll do a second edition and update it.
Well, I would like to very much get back to L'Oreal because that's quite a fascinating topic. But beforehand, before we get into some of the specifics, just to help set our course, because this, like we said, it's not typical analytic fodder. What is the role, or what do you see the role of philosophy in your philosophical training, in your investigation of self-love and that attendant constellation of emotions and dispositions that you mentioned? So vanity, embarrassment, arrogance. So I'm wondering if your philosophical purpose here is less academic in the sense that you're not trying to construct rigorous arguments, but more commonplace, and that it's critical and reflective, or maybe it harkens back to more of an ancient or classical philosophical attitude, and that it's more geared toward normative advice about self-improvement and living the good life, that sort of thing.
Yes. Well, of course, that's a very respectable part of philosophy from the beginning. I mean, all the Greek schools, Plato, Aristotle, Epicureans, Cyrenaics, Stoics, they all saw it as part of their mission to understand the good life, to try to put people on paths of personal improvement so that they would behave better and society would be better as a result. Plato's dialogues are largely about that kind of topic. Aristotle's two famous works, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudaimonian Ethics, are about self-improvement, and Stoics, gave advice on how to cope with the ills of the world. And so it's not a foreign to philosophy. And of course, that does generate a literature, which I did have access to. So I could draw on, I'm not a scholar, but I could draw on my sense of the history and what people like Aristotle or Hobbes or Hume had said about these things. So to that extent, I weave in, some of my professional knowledge. But it is, as you rightly say, it's more a sort of general critique of the moral climate of our times and some of its aspects. And, I was pleasantly surprised when the publisher wanted it, actually. I thought it was a bit of a hodgepodge. Didn't have a plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a ramble around a landscape, which I just found quite interesting. But I'm pleased to say others found it interesting too. So that was nice.
Mm-hmm. So you've already mentioned L'Oreal, so I think that's a good place to start. And I think you write explicitly, maybe it's in the preface or acknowledgments, that your principal debt in writing on self-love is to L'Oreal. And maybe we could get into just what, or get more into what made you feel such despair because you're at the phrase "because you're worth it." And I thought it was quite funny in the book. You pointed out, I hadn't known this, that they once wanted to use the catchphrase "because I'm worth it," which certainly feels much more expressly vain and probably wouldn't have caught on the same way.
Well, exactly. I'm still not sure I got to the bottom of it, but my own understanding of my emotions was that I think this is still my understanding, that the advertising slogan is based on an almighty lie, because the appeal is basically to people who feel they're not worth it. They're not in the same ballpark as the models, the people who are photographed looking proud and disdainful and narcissistic on the catwalks or in the perfume advertisements. And it's people who aspire to that or fear that they're not up to it in some way. So the real slogan should have been, because you're not worth it. You'd like to be, but you'd like to be. And here's the promise, and here's another lie, of course. The promise is that if you buy our goo, you will become like the person in the ad, and happy and contented, and somebody the world worships and who doesn't have to pay too much attention for other people, and so on. Because the persona, the other thing about it, which I found hard to understand to begin with, was that the models in the ads, the persona, are disdainful. They're sort of, they're not smiling and laughing and saying, yeah, hey, have this perfume, this is great fun. They're looking proud. They're looking independent. They don't really care what you think about them. That's not the only persona that's projected in those ads, but it was a large part of it. And I thought that this was interesting. Why do people aspire to that kind of psychology when in real life there's nothing worse than that? Somebody arrogant. If you meet somebody arrogant at a party, you make your excuses and sidle off. Arrogance is not an attractive human trait. And yet the models look arrogant. At least that was my take on them. And in a way disdainful. They look through us or past us. And I couldn't understand why that was an attractive role model, something to aspire to. So that was another thing that I found I had to write about to try to understand. I'm not sure whether I succeeded, but I tackled it head on anyhow.
What do you think you emerged from the investigation with regard to this one dimension? Why it is that we find the arrogant, at least looking like catwalk model so attractive?
I think, although people mightn't be ready to admit it, many people find the burdens of everyday politeness, everyday having to deal with other people, having to listen to other people's problems, having to accommodate other people in our lives. That's something which, at least in some moods, we rather wish we could minimize or do without altogether, even if we are loving spouses, or if we have children even, or grandchildren and parents, and all the encumbrances of daily life. And I think people at some level think it'd be kind of neat to be free of all that, at least for a while. And the fantasy that the L'Oreal was selling, I think, was the fantasy of being independent, of being self-sufficient, of being kind of you're able to strut your way around your own world without too much compromise, too many accommodations with the needs of other people. And that's an understandable ambition, I think, for people. It's understandable that they, at least at some level, fancy that as sort of a kind of dream or ideal. And so it's not a particularly attractive trait of human beings. I think we are deeply social animals. And if we regret society, then I think that's a fault in us. But it's there, and it's how it proved attractive. It was a very successful campaign.
Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to mind for me as somebody with, I guess, low self-esteem and then a lot of social anxiety is the idea of seeing the arrogant looking, somewhat beautiful model. You think of, if you put this goop, to use your word, on your face and it transforms you into this sort of person, then you just have this carefree attitude and no longer have to be burdened by your feelings of inadequacy and how other people are judging you. And in a sense, it becomes a sort of, it's just goop, but it becomes armor for you.
Become armor. Well, as I said, I think you put it very well, and probably better than I put it. But the actual appeal, the money that's pouring into L'Oreal, I think does come largely from people who are afraid of being inadequate or feel that they're inadequate. They feel stressed. At the extreme, of course, they may feel, in some sense, ugly or handicapped, or in some sense, below the bar for human society. And so, of course, such people may have very serious needs. And a dream is one answer to a need of that kind. So, yes, I think that's right. What is not the case is that a goop will give you the solution.
Right. I just read this brilliant book by Joyce Carol Oates called Them. And have you read that book?
No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
Okay, one of the central, I think, ideas, though, is that no matter where we are in society or in life, even if we're the poorest of the poor or whatever, we always need to point at somebody else and think that we're better than them. And I see that with also the goop, putting the goop on your face. It sort of elevates you to this point where you can look down at other people. But it also, this idea points to this distinction between two different types of vanity that you identify in the book.
Yeah, right. Yes, the one type of vanity is that of the persona, the model, with the conceit, as it were, or bordering on narcissism, extremist narcissism. I only care about myself. I don't care about anyone else. And that can be described as a kind of vanity. But I think narcissism or conceit is possibly a better word. Whereas the more common kind of vanity, I think, is a kind of obsessive desire for praise or admiration from other people.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I'm just going to quote you because what you say in the way you describe it in the book, this second kind of vanity is one that depends on exciting the attention and approbation of others. And going back to what I was saying earlier, you're not just putting on this goop as a form of armor to be immune from other people's criticisms or their watchful eyes, but it's much stronger than that. We all have this desire because we're social animals. The most important thing for us is status and to be loved and admired. And we see that we have such a poverty of inwardly inward self, I mean, I guess that's kind of redundant, but self-esteem that's sort of welling up within us as if from an internal spring that we need to get it from other people. And that's one of the things that this advertising campaign is preying upon.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's right. And of course, the difference then between that kind of vanity and what I call in the book proper pride.
Yeah.
That that kind of vanity, what it requires, the only thing that feeds it is applause or admiration from other people. It doesn't really matter whether that applause or admiration is deserved. So long as it's obtained, the rat is fed, the need is gratified. Whereas proper pride, you need to be doing something well in your own eyes. And it need not matter whether other people appreciate it or not. As craftsman might work by himself, herself, on a particular piece of work and regard it as a good day's work and feel satisfied if they've done it as best they can or done it as best it could be done. And that's a source of satisfaction. And if that's your source of satisfaction, you're not likely to be vain in that second sense, because you would feel sort of, if you like, corrupted by the applause of other people if you felt you hadn't earned it. Feel that was somehow showed that they didn't know what they were talking about. Therefore, their applause is not worth it. It could have been done better, and you're slightly ashamed of what you've done. So other people's applause actually twists the knife in the wound. And that, I think, is proper pride. And that's to do with self-esteem and feeling that you've got a task on hand which could be done well, and that you've done it well. And that's good news. I feel that when I'm writing, if I put something as well as I think it could be put, and occasionally, it just happens only occasionally, then of course it's very pleasing. It's the end of a good day's work, and I'm very happy. If the critics don't like the book, well, that's their problem.
Well, okay, so the book is much, much large. I mean, this L'Oreal example only takes up part of one chapter. So I'm sorry for harping on it so much, but I find it quite interesting.
Well, it's a fountain from which a lot of the rest of the book does follow. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There were a couple of other things I want to ask about it though before we move on. One, do you have Dove soap in the UK?
Yes, we do.
Do you prefer their advertisement campaign? I don't know if you have the same one that we have here.
I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
It's not, we don't watch commercial television very much.
No, that's fine. They exclusively use sort of much more quotidian looking average individuals, and it is starkly different from the other companies.
Good. Well, I'm glad that they find an audience. I mean, I know that these huge companies don't mount these advertising campaigns without a lot of thought, and presumably maybe the times have changed a bit. I don't know, but if Joe Doe is shown using Dove soap, that may be attractive to people that wonder how it works. I haven't seen the ads, so I can't critique it sensibly. But it's interesting. It would not surprise me that there's some kind of reaction against the catwalk look, the parade of this kind of dream, because the dreams have a nasty habit of imploding under people, and presumably a lot of people have started to reject the kind of excessive concern with body image, which led to things like breast transplants as well as like L'Oreal. So maybe those things are on the down. I don't know.
Well, the last thing that I would like to ask about it before we can move on to some of the other subjects in the book is whether you think it's unnatural or, in a sense, wrong to admire these fashion models in the way that we do, or that it's so wrong to be invested in one's personal appearance when we do know just how important it is. I mean, you're more likely to get a job, you're more likely to, find a desire, all of these things if you're more attractive.
Yes, I wouldn't say it's wrong at all. I don't think it's a moral failing. It's not like beating your kids or something. But I would say that it's in some sense sad. I think part of it is, as you sort of hinted already, inevitable. That is, people who are beautiful are admirable. You know, if when they come into a room they knock your socks off, then you can't help it. You find that attractive, and you, to some extent, wish you were in the same boat. We don't like to look like, Brad Pitt or Marilyn Monroe or whoever it is, and that's I think part of the human way. It's part of the way we measure ourselves against others, which I think is important to social life.
Well, maybe there's a healthier way to perceive one's investment in one's appearance that makes it distinct or divorces it from concerns of like real deep self-worth.
Yes. Well, I think the healthier way of measuring yourself against other people is if you've got a trade that you apply, if you've got something you do, or if you've just got a hobby that you're interested in, then there will be typically such a thing as doing it well or doing it badly. And it's natural that you want to emulate the people who do it well and, hope that you're not doing it badly. And that's true for almost all our activities, I think. In my spare time, I sometimes do a bit of woodwork. Well, I know I've never, I've never attended classes. I picked up what I could from my father, who was quite ill. And I enjoy it. But I would never dream of showing off my skill to anyone else, because I'm pretty well aware that it's nothing like what a good craftsman could be like. One of my grandchildren is a luthier. He makes guitars and things, and that's a real skill, which I envy. But I can't aspire to it.
Mm-hmm. I play the drums, and I actually do the introduction to these episodes when they're on YouTube and completely edited as my drumming. But it's not something that I'm particularly good at, but I do it every day for 20 or 30 minutes. And it's just, it does gives me a sense of good feeling and value, just that I'm getting better at something.
Yes.
Something.
That's right. And if something comes out really well, and you've made the measurements correctly, you've got in my case, you've chosen the right wood, you've got the tools adequately sharp and so on, then there's a pleasure, which quiet pleasure, but it's a change from writing philosophy, that's for sure. Mm-hmm.
But a big difference, I guess, between the drumming or the woodworking and the beauty is that the former comes from concerted effort and investment. And that isn't to say that you can't spend a lot of time in the bathroom trying to make yourself pretty, but a lot of that is genetic. It's not something that you as the self have engendered.
No, that's right. And I think I would think that it's, well, I don't want to sound very critical, and I don't want to sound like a moralist, but I just said that there's something proper about taking a small pleasure in doing something like woodwork or drumming or certainly a musical instrument, either making them or playing them well. It's an admirable activity. Whereas if you go down amongst your friends in the bar and say, gosh, I really worked hard today, I spent an hour on my makeup, then I don't think you could expect much admiration. Even if you're unless you're in a very strange subgroup of humanity.
Right. Yeah, granted, I mean, there are exceptions. I mean, makeup art is a serious thing, but that's different from what we're talking about.
Yes, that's right, it is.
Yeah. And of course, there's also, I mean, skill in modeling. And we're not saying that models actually, as people, necessarily embody the sort of arrogance that we were describing earlier, but it is what is projected in the advertisements for a specific purpose.
Oh, yes, I'm quite clear about that in the book. Say the actual model may be a poor anorexic girl or something, very low self-esteem, but she knows how to look the part, and that's all that's required of her.
Well, moving on to another, I don't want to say more substantive, because this has been very substantive, but more substantive maybe in a historical or philosophical sense. You mentioned narcissism earlier, and I was wondering if you might be able to tell the tale of Narcissus, because I mean, maybe not the whole thing. It's a long tale, but I think everyone knows that he drowns in a body of water because he thinks he's beautiful, but I don't think people are familiar with more of the story behind it.
No, well, right. Well, as it's told in Metamorphoses by Ovid, the Roman poet, he was the son of a nymph, so he was semi-divine. He was also the subject of a prophecy by Tiresias, the famous blind seer who could see the future, who said that he prophesied a long and happy life for Narcissus, if himself he does not know. So there's this rider, and this is a very strange thing for the Greeks, because know thyself was one of the injunctions over the shrine at Delphi. It's thought that was one of the first axioms of living well, to know who you are, know yourself. So it's very strange to say he's going to have a much better life if he doesn't know himself. But anyhow, then the story switches to where when he's an adolescent, 16 years old or so. He's very attractive. Lots and lots of people have been obsessed by him, tried to make out with him, and in particular the nymph Echo. Now, the interesting thing about Echo is, of course, that she only ever throws your own voice back at yourself. And so that's a slightly sinister side of the story. And I think it's extremely important because, of course, the narcissist will hear his own voice, and perhaps only his own voice. I'll use his, of course we mean his or hers. In other words, the narcissist is taken up with their own self-approbation. It's their own, what they imagine is a reflection of their own being pleased at themselves. And so this is Narcissus' problem. And then he's a shepherd. He's out in the country. He's by himself in the woodland glade. He comes across this very still pond, looks in, sees his reflection, and falls in love. And so he falls in love with his own reflection. That's of a piece with only hearing echo. It's the same kind of self-obsession. And as a result, he can't leave the reflection alone. He's in some respects the perfect match, because if he moves towards the smooth surface of the water, the reflection moves towards him. It's rather like a parody of a relationship. But it's eventually his death. He pines away and dies. And so Tiresias's prophecy turns out to have been true. By knowing himself, he killed himself. Another curious feature of the myth is that there's no body left. There's nothing left except where he dies, the little flower, the small narcissus, like a small daffodil. It's called a jonquil, which is interesting because it's a flower that bows its head towards the ground. Yes, so it's I don't know whether that's a significant feature of the myth, but it's interesting that that's where he ends up. That we're humbled, I think, by his failed career, his failed love affair, his failure to engage with other people, his failure as a social being, and all out of an excess of self-love. So that's the story of Narcissus, and I think it's very like all Greek myths. It's got a sinister side, and it's got a lot of psychological insight in it. I think in particular the fact that he only hears echo. That's the only voice he ever hears, and it's his own voice, is very important to the phenomenon of narcissism, because I think that's true of the narcissist. The voice that matters to him is his own voice. So when people ask whether Trump has a narcissistic personality disorder, I think the diagnostic I would use is, well, does he ever listen to other people? As far as I understand it, no. And does he have an enormously conceited self-image? Yes. So he's well on the spectrum. I know that diagnosticians from the psychologists in the USA have been a little bit cautious about saying that he's on that spectrum, but it seems to me there's no doubt about it. So I think it's a very interesting myth, which we can apply to people we know. I would go on at length about Boris Johnson, but I think Johnson may be nearer to being vague. Both him and Trump, both he and Trump, lash out if they face actual criticism. The actual voice of other people is profoundly irritating to them. It's as if they want to hide away from social scrutiny, from any kind of scrutiny. And I think that's more to do with not so much delusions of self-worth, but the fear of inadequacy that you mentioned earlier. It's anything that suggests less than perfect adulation from other people is uncomfortable and starts to chip away at their carefully constructed sense of who they are. So that's Narcissus though, and I think he's amongst us.
Yeah. No, thanks so much for recounting the tale. And I just parenthetically, do you know if our word echo comes from the name of Ovid's Echo?
I don't know that. I know that our word Narcissus for the flower comes from the myth.
Okay, that's very neat.
It might easily come from, that might be the first, but I'd have to look at the Oxford Dictionary to see, Dictionary of Etymology. I can answer that for you after we finish this.
Sure. Yeah. It's so clear why mirrors are such a great theme in books, in films, in poetry. As you were talking, I was thinking about this poem, For Once Then Something, by Robert Frost. Is that one that happens to ring a bell for you?
I know a fair amount of Frost poetry, but I can't place that offhand. Can we quote it?
Yeah, I could read it. I don't know. If we want to get into poetry, I mean, you quote Shakespeare's Sonnet 62 in your book, and that's another one worth talking about. But in the Robert Frost poem, he is I can recount what happens. I don't have it right in front of me, but he is constantly looking in wells. I guess people taunt him for it, looking for his reflection, and then a pebble or a drop of water or something falls into the well, revealing that there's something at the bottom of the well. And the poem is called For Once Then Something, and the poem ends with he finally sees that there's something under the reflection, and he says, "Oh, for once, then there's actually something real there." So,
Right, that's interesting. So, is his thought that what's really under the reflection is, in a sense, his own self, the self that he's disguised with those series of images of himself? Or is it something else, other facts, other people, other society?
it's been a long time since I read it closely, but yes, I think there was something to do with as I recall, the superficiality of the exterior, and that there is something much deeper within us than what meets the eye.
Yes. Well, of course, it is true that Narcissus, even in the myth, it's superficial in the sense that he can't touch the image he falls in love with. He can't hear it. It's just echo when he uses his own voice. So, as it were, he is condemned to a world of illusion, or a world of mere appearance. He's not getting at even himself, let alone another person. So I think Frost must be picking up that as something that's needed, something to go beyond the superficial, the world of the mirror.
Now, we're talking now about the superficiality of appearances, and I guess that we were talking a bit about that when we were going over L'Oreal, but maybe this connects a bit with lust, in that I guess I'm wondering how erotic, outward, maybe superficial love connects with self-love, the deeper self-love.
Right.
I keep bringing up examples from the media, but are you familiar with Bret Easton Ellis?
No, I'm afraid I know who he is, but
Okay.
I've never.
Have you seen the movie American Psycho?
No, I never have.
Okay, that's another great movie, but there's a really terrific scene where Patrick Bateman, who's the main character, and he's a psychopath, and he is constantly sleeping with and murdering prostitutes. But there's a scene in which he's having sex with a prostitute, but he's just looking at himself flexing in the mirror the entire time that he's doing it, and he's like video cameraing himself.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and that's a parody of what a relationship should be, obviously, and it's clearly psychopathology. I don't know the movie, but I can understand the trope that's if somebody's doing that, then had to escape, get away from it, because self-obsession is not supposed to coexist with the real concern for being with another person. That makes sex intercourse, in a sense, permissible, certainly enjoyable to both parties. Yes, I think I think at some point in the book, Lust, at some whilst that I looked at that book, it was written more than 15 years ago. I do talk about the dehumanization of sex and contrast that with what I think lust at its best should be. So it's at its best, it needs to be erotic. And the eros is about a two-person relationship. And I remember I quote Hobbes saying that the passion that men call lust is partly carnal, but it's not only that. It's partly a pleasure at feeling that you can give so much pleasure. So if you're attentive to the pleasure of the other person, you're entitled to feel pleased if you're giving them pleasure. And so you get this sort of build-up of the interplay of minds, which so it's part of lust at its best.
Interesting. I think that the etymological root there has been lost in our current use of the word, because when I think of, you can call an image erotic or all sorts of things erotic, and it doesn't necessarily imply this deeper interpersonal connection and back and forth.
It gets lost. Yeah. No, the eros is a god, and you want to be very careful about messing around with gods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not usually a good thing to do in the mythological corpus.
No.
So I think you might have mentioned earlier, unless I'm fabricating this, you just mentioned offhand that psychologists might label Trump or somebody as having a narcissistic personality disorder. But in the book, I think there's an entire chapter devoted to psychology and narcissism. And how do psychologists think of narcissists? I think, as I recall, they view it more as an indicator of low self-esteem rather than classifying it as like debilitating self-love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I think I'm not a clinical psychologist and I'm not a doctor, so I'm speculating rather. My sense is that you can think of the fully blown narcissistic person, Narcissus himself, if you like, as a consequence of a certain kind of upbringing, a certain kind of relationship with his parents, and so on. And for all I know, there may be good empirical evidence that it is when A happens in childhood, that B happens in adult life, and you've got a fully fledged narcissist. But I wasn't very interested in that. I was interested in the, as a condition itself, not so interested in the etiology of it, in what brings it about, what's the history behind this. Do you blame the parents? Do you blame the environment? Was it school day traumas? What brought it about? I leave that to the people who study such things, and I don't. I'm not sure that I'm not sure it helps the identification of the fully fledged state. That is, whether it's caused by your parents or by a gene or by something in the environment, wrong kind of water or something, doesn't, it seems to me, affect how it comes out, how it's manifested in the adult or the adolescent, the narcissistic person. That is, this isn't a priori versus empirical. It's just that my empirical gaze is fixed on what we've got if we've got a grown-up narcissist, not on what his childhood was like. To a large extent, I don't care. I don't care what Trump's childhood was like. I don't care what Boris Johnson's childhood was like. What I do care about is the traits they manifest day to day as we've got them fully fledged. And those are the traits which mean that they deserve or do not deserve the title narcissists. I think they do deserve it, but somebody comes along and says, oh no, there's a further criterion which I'd like to advance, which they don't meet, I'll listen, but I'd be surprised if it really sways me very much. And the further criterion was they didn't have a bad relationship with their mother or whatever. I'd say I'm not sure what that's got to do with it. It's how they are now that bothers me, not what their history was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, setting, like you said, setting the ideology of the narcissism aside, I know a few people I might classify as narcissists in this psychological sense. And what I would identify in them is, one, an inability to form relationships with other people, but then this goes hand in hand with a very intense self-awareness and obsession with their own wants and needs. But this doesn't necessarily have any introspective depth. It's really just like a visceral, they're very connected to it. And it's this like wholly devoted attention to the needs and desires of the self that makes us perceive them as narcissists.
Yes, I think that's right. They can't be taken out of themselves, as we say.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And I think that's a very important part of it. I think there's. I think you mentioned earlier, and I would agree entirely, that there is, as it were, a likely sign of fighting off low self-esteem. That is the sort of almost visceral fear of criticism, the speed, anger with which the narcissists deflect criticism, even hint of criticism, is likely to be some kind of reaction against something they can't cope with. And being unable to cope with criticism is surely a sign of a very vulnerable self-esteem, a very vulnerable sense of self that's compensated for by prioritizing itself, by thinking of nothing but the self.
Moving toward, well, in the interest of time, getting toward some, I guess, more positive dimensions of the book, I found your discussion of pride quite interesting. In that, while, as you mentioned, it's like the root of all evil in Judeo-Christian sort of teachings, it's at the same time something to cherish and to foster, perhaps in the sense that it's, well, I wouldn't say pride is synonymous with integrity, but it can be a motivating force in our goodness.
Yes, it can. And I think it often is. That is, you don't want to let yourself down. You don't want to let your friends down. Pride is, commensurate with shame. That is, if you're sufficiently proud, you feel ashamed if you have committed a gaffe, you've done something badly, you've, in some sense, let yourself down. And that is, I think, a kind of proper self-esteem which keeps us on the paths that we need to tread very often. Somebody who's got no pride will, well, as Kant said, I think I quote him in the book, if you let yourself be a worm, you can't be surprised if people tread on you. And a proper pride stops you from being a creep. It stops you from fawning on other people, stops you from, in some sense, abasing yourself in order to curry favor or whatever it might be. There's certain things which, if you're proud, you just won't do. So So I think that's a very important, not necessarily a guarantee, but certainly an adjunct of good behavior. And I was very pleased to find Milton, Puritan, of course, but saying that self-esteem was second only to love of God as a guarantee of virtue. Is Milton's world, what guarantees virtue is love of God. What plays second fiddle, as it were, but no less an important part of the orchestra, is self-esteem. You won't let yourself down. And there's a passage I quote to that effect from Milton. So, yes, I think proper pride, I use self-esteem and pride more or less synonymously, I think. Self-esteem doesn't have quite the sound of sin about it that pride is accrued from the Christians. But I think it's more or less the same thought, that if you esteem yourself, there's some things you won't let yourself do. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's perhaps a bit Puritan, but mostly I think it's capable of being well adjusted, and when it's well adjusted, it's a good thing.
Well, a tension, or maybe you wouldn't want to describe it as a tension, but that I noticed in the book is that most of us recognize we're too hard on ourselves, though of course, as we've discussed, there are some people who really are overly in love with themselves and are not too hard on themselves at all, but that we know that the remedy for this is self-love. I mean, whether that's dieting or indulging in some more sleep, just taking better care of ourselves, but that despite this knowledge that we all have, it doesn't get us anywhere closer to enacting it. Do you have, I guess, advice, or did some conclusion present itself to you as you're writing this book about how we ought to actually enact the common sense we all know, that we ought to give ourselves some more love?
I don't go into that, and I'm not sure I do. I'm rather mistrustful of self-help gurus, and a lot of it is just woo-woo, and I think it's sort of ridiculous. But I think that finding your way around the landscape, to me, is an important adjunct to behaving reasonably well. I mean, I know that if I'm behaving in a way that, as it were, I'd be slightly ashamed of if, somebody I cared about was watching, or somebody whose good opinion I valued. If I'm glad that nobody whose good opinion I valued is as it were, aware, that's good. Sometimes, of course, that's just because, there's certain decencies, modesty, and so on. You don't want people seeing you, do your toilet. But sometimes it's because you're aware that you'll be the target of criticism. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, I think. And one does well to take notice of that. If you think you're, if you're having words with your spouse or your partner or children even, and you catch yourself, as it were, saying things you don't mean, or letting rip in some way, then it's not a bad thing to draw breath, count to 3, count to 10, say, let's go over this again tomorrow, whatever it is. Deflect the problem. And I think that's one way of avoiding temptation. Temptations often, as I think I mentioned in connection with Eve and Adam, they come, I think, not so much because of defects of pride, contrary to the Christian tradition. I mean, I know it's supposed that Eve fell, the serpent managed to tempt her because it appealed to her pride. I'm not quite sure that's the right word. What the serpent actually appealed to, again, this is Milton's great epic, Paradise Lost, was the fact that there's only one man to admire. And so, in a sense, it appeals to her vanity. He says that you should be admired by angels numberless, your daily train. That is, she should aspire to a condition of being honored and admired and followed, all those other good things. And I don't think it's a necessarily pride, but it's a sort of temptation of vanity. Which I think gets
It's interesting that all these stories go back in some way or connect some way with the idea of self-love. I mean, God even makes Adam in his own image. And what else is that supposed to be?
No, I know. And God loves praise. I mean, come on.
Oh, he sure does. You can't praise false idols. That's for sure. Only him.
Right. Yeah. I've never quite understood God's penchant for praise.
Yeah, you'd think that if you're all powerful, that's the last thing you'd need.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that's what the Epicureans thought in ancient Greece, that the immortal nature is just too grand to care about what the heck we do, whether we praise him or not. It's like whether your cat praises you. It's not.
My cat does not give me nearly enough praise. No, the dog does, though.
Dogs are better at that, yes.
Okay, Simon. Well, this has been, a very different episode, philosophically speaking, from most of the episodes I've done, but it was so fun, such a great conversation. Thank you so much for doing this with me for a second time now. Well,
thank you, Robinson. It's been a pleasure talking to you again. And it's always fun to get off the analytic pitch and onto something of wider human interest, anyhow. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Thanks to your well-behaved cat.
Yeah, she did a good job this episode. Thanks so much, Simon.
Okay, all right, bye-bye then.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please like, subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Erhardt, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Erhardt on Robinson Eats, please do so.